Shalom, Salam, Alafia, Jambo, and all other greetings of peace. And welcome to the 2017 Black Sustainability Summit. My name is Chanowk Yirsael with the Yisrael Family Urban Farm, and we are transforming the hood for good using urban agriculture to engage, employ, and empower our community. My presentation today will talk about how to eat in a changing world without going insane. Because if you pay attention to food recalls and you pay attention to the different additives that they're starting to add to even our organic foods, then sometimes you might even be afraid to eat at all. So we're going to kind of navigate some of those myths, talk about what we do at our urban farm, as well as take you through a couple of things in my life that got me to the point where I am today. My goal isn't to teach you exactly how to grow food or to answer your every single question, nor am I going to litter it with a whole bunch of scientific slides to talk about this and that. But my goal is to inspire you and to give you hope that someone just like you who may be new to getting into growing their own food can go from 9-to-5 job with no understanding or connection to nature at all to a full-fledged urban homesteader. Like I said before, what makes this different is I'm going to just talk to you from my heart. I may use a few pictures here and there to kind of give you the understanding behind what I'm saying, but like I said, it's not going to be your typical presentation. And after doing this for 7 years, I realized that it's much better to deal with Mother Nature than to depend on Lady Luck. And I learned this all the hard way, and you get to cheat and get it the easy way. These two people here are my parents, and it's the best place for me to start about my journey from 9-to-5 employee to urban homesteader. My mother on the right hand side, or maybe your left depending on how you're looking at the picture. In 1986, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. In 1989, she was also diagnosed with breast cancer again, and since then she's gone on to survive 4 breast cancer surgeries. My dad, in 2002, had his kidney removed for cancer. So, with both of my parents having invasive forms of cancer, then the doctors pretty much gave me a sentence that I was going to get cancer too, because of course, cancer is hereditary and it's in your DNA. But I just couldn't buy any of that. And there are some things that happened to me that made me understand that this couldn't be my future. And the thing that happened is I had a friend, and that friend had multiple sclerosis. And in having multiple sclerosis, you understand that sometimes you can't walk, sometimes that you can't see. Well, for him, it was both of them. Not only could he not walk, but he also had to wear those old glasses that 75-year-old people wear, those black glasses with the little lenses on the side that cover your complete eyes. And one day he got a book, and that book was called African Holistic Health by Lila Africa. And after reading that book, he said, I'm going to heal myself, and I'm going to be walking around like you one day. And in the period of about 16 months, that's exactly what he did. He stopped taking the medicine, he started to get on a raw diet, he cut out the meat, and he started taking herbs. And I saw him go from blind to sight. And I saw him go from crippled to walking. And to this day, he is completely multiple sclerosis free. All by changing his diet and by taking herbs. So after I saw this happen, I realized that I could change my destiny by changing the foods that I ate. And that's exactly what I did. I went in the backyard. As you can see the picture here, these are 3 beds. I did this in 2007. And 2007 is a very special time because if you remember, that's when they said that we're going to have the second Great Depression again, or they called it the Great Recession. The economy crashed. Homes started being foreclosed on. It was just a very hard time economically. And so I was sitting in my cubicle. I'm a computer engineer by trade. And I was sitting in my cubicle. And I said, I've got to start growing some food in my backyard. I've got to start taking this seriously. And so that's exactly what I did. I had those 3 beds that you see in front of you built. I'd had no woodworking experience, so I had to pay somebody to build the wood. And I started growing food in my backyard. Well, it kind of started a little strange though, because the first time I did it, I spent about $250. I had these raised beds. I put all this food in the backyard. And within 2 weeks, everything I planted was dead. Why? Well, because any fool knows that you don't plant a garden in the middle of Sacramento heat when sometimes the temperatures get all the way up to 100 in the summertime. But being so disconnected from natural cycles, being so disconnected from where my food come from, and being so disconnected from just the universe in general, I thought I could just put food out anytime. In fact, I used to look around and say, how hard could it be to grow food? I see plants and trees and all these things growing all the time. But I soon realized that it was much different. So I went from the picture that you see when we first started to this picture here. And there's a couple of things that got me to that way. First, I took a class, and I took this class, and in the class there was something that the instructor said that changed my whole perspective on growing food. Because looking at it from a mechanical perspective, I'm always thinking, okay, well, if you feed the plant and you feed the plant and you feed the plant and you feed the plant, then you'll have a nice healthy plant and it'll look great and it'll be good for you. Well, what I found out is that that's the same type of rationale that the chemical companies have and those people who practice conventional agriculture. Because that's what they do. They put things specifically in the soil in order to feed the plant, NPK, and all of the other. They don't even think about any of the micronutrients or any of the minerals that plants need. As long as it's got NPK, then the plant will be just fine. What the instructor said to me is this: real farmers don't grow food. Real farmers grow soil. And once I realized that, then bam, I was on a whole different level then. Because if you feed the soil, then the plants already know what to do with the nutrition. And when you feed the soil, not only are you feeding the plant, but you're feeding the fungi, the bacteria, and the invertebrates, who in my youth mentorship program, I always refer to as the FBI, because they operate in secret. But in feeding those fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates, then they actually produce substances that not only feed the plant, but also help the soil. So, in feeding the soil, you also feed the organisms, and you're also feeding the plant. And the organisms themselves, because they have such a wonderful environment to live in, also feed the soil, as you can see from what you saw before to what you see now. And shortly after that, I was able to come up with 110 pounds of produce, such as eggplants, as you see on the back, on the right there, that are purple. And behind those, you see the okra, cucumbers, squash, tomatoes, peppers, all types of different things. And this is in the middle of the summer. And for somebody who, having a background like mine in the computer industry, I didn't even mow my grass. I had a service. I had people come and mow my grass for me. So really understanding that you can go from ground zero, not knowing anything about agriculture, nothing about plants, nothing about nature, and you can turn around and grow yourself 110 pounds of food. Now, I did this within about maybe about 600 square feet. A little bit about myself. Like I said, um, when my parents got cancer in 1986, 1989, and then 2002, it really, really threw me for a loop. And I joke affectionately with my dad, and he jokes back with me that he used to be able to feed me with a pack of hot dogs, a loaf of bread, Kraft macaroni and cheese, and a box of Velveeta. And now I want to eat vegetables and fruits and nuts and all these different types of things. I don't eat the meat. And if I do eat meat, it's going to be a certain type of meat, um, and what have you. And like I said, in going through the process of complete disconnection from nature into where I am today, it led me to a whole bunch of things. Now, I just want to talk a little bit, as you see these characters in front of you. You see this character here, um, these characters, this character here, and this character here, and this character here. So my name is Hebrew, and if you're familiar with languages, then you know, of course, that all languages at some point were all pictures. And so as I talk about my first name, Chanowk, it actually means to be dedicated, and it means to be disciplined, and it means to initiate or to be an initiator. But when you take it back to its pictorial form, this letter here, Kaith, is a wall. This letter here, it looks like a little seed. Kaith Noon, and then Wav, and then Kaf, Sophe. So in Hebrew, in a literal speaking, this name means strong hands that builds walls to protect seeds. And at the time when I started to grow the food, I knew what that meant. So it's kind of written in my name and other things that have happened to me, such as conversations with my elders and what have you, that led me to this idea of growing my own food. And take a look at the picture. If you look at that ball of soil there, I'm in the process of teaching a class about soil. So I started growing food in my backyard, and those things took off. So we got an award from the Alpha Kappa Alpha Far Western region, which encompasses about 7 states, for sustainability and stewardship. And then just as recently as a couple years ago, I was featured on the cover of the Sacramento News and Review, which goes out to about maybe 300,000 to 400,000 people here in the Sacramento area, about urban farms. And not just urban farms, but the politics of urban farms and the politics of food. Because as I started to go through my journey, I realized that I wanted to sell food and I wanted to share this to other people. And I couldn't, because I found out that it was illegal to grow food and be able to sell it. Well, since then, we've passed 2 ordinances, along with another organization called the Sacramento Urban Agriculture Coalition. And both of those ordinances make it by right that you can grow food within the city and the county limits, and you can take that food and put it in your front yard and sell it in a farm stand way, and make you some money. Then I was approached by an organization called Slow Food. Just a little background about Slow Food. They started in 1986 with an Italian journalist who was protesting against the McDonald's going into Rome. And their moniker or their slogan was, "We don't want fast food, we want slow food." It became an organization. It's in 120 countries throughout the world. And they approached me to become a delegate to go to a conference called We Feed the Planet. And We Feed the Planet basically is about 1,400 people, young people, from 120 different countries for 4 days to talk about the global state of food. And quite frankly, that could be a presentation all in itself. And while the conference was great and the things that were talked about at the conference were great, what was even better was the networking. So I got to meet farmers from South America, and we got to talk about the Chinampas, which is the precursor to the modern raised beds that we use today. I got to talk to farmers from Ethiopia. I got to talk to farmers from Burkina Faso. I got to talk to farmers from Uganda. I got to talk to farmers from all parts of Asia. And the way that they talked about what we call in the United States urban agriculture was so enlightening to me. So at some point, I want to be able to make a presentation about that. But anyways, I got to go to Italy and spend some time there, and I found out that food is much different in different places. So then after that, in February of last year, the Sacramento Kings, which is our local basketball team, honored myself and my wife Judith as Sacramento King Dream All-Stars for Black History Month for our work in the community. Now, I want to welcome you to my neighborhood, South Oak Park. It's known for fast food restaurants, corner stores, and empty lots. You know, a food desert. A place where you can get 20 pieces of Church's chicken for $5.99 before you can get an orange, before you can get an apple, before you can get a grape or a fresh head of lettuce. It's a place where most of the people live under the poverty level. And not only do they live under the poverty level, but it's a place where people talk about, and I'm sure you got a place like that in your city that's probably located somewhere by Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. But when people talk about it out that don't live there, they say Oak Park, and people go, ooh, you live in Oak Park? Like, you know, people should be scared to walk around. But in reality, when you really understand gentrification, you'll find out that story that's given to an area, especially by the media, of being high crime and all these different things, helps to drive the property prices down. And then once the property prices are down, then developers come in and start to rebuild the area, also known as gentrification, and then it starts to push other people out. But anyways, like I said, this is where I live. So in a typical food desert, here's an idea that you have here. So in a typical food desert, you'll find that there's a lot of children between 0 to 18 that are suffering from not having enough nutrition or food, as well as single parents, disabled parents, grandchildren, everything. So these are the type of people that you might find in a food desert. So here I am growing all this food in my backyard, and I still live in the food desert, which I found out. Because up until then, I wasn't paying any attention to that. I was so focused on making sure that I was able to grow the food in my backyard and learning the process that I kind of had my head in the sand. And then finally, I started to do some research. I found that this quote unquote urban farming was something that was happening all over the country. And I read about places like Detroit. I read about places like Cleveland, New York. I read about Los Angeles and all these different places that are doing urban farming. So here I was thinking that it was something new, but it wasn't. So then I realized that we lived in a food desert. I knew that we didn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, but I just didn't know what that was called. And even now, I've even evolved that after, talking to some very knowledgeable elders. We even call it a food apartheid nowadays, because you can juxtapose a picture to show where all the black people live, where all the schools have been closed, where all the food deserts are, and then where all the high crime areas are. And there's a marked connection between eating habits and crime. Anyways, I digress. And we started a program called We Dig It Urban Gardens. There was a local nonprofit organization that pretty much went under. And in going under, they were doing this program where they were building gardens in people's backyards. And so we found out who was doing it and, who was the funder. And we said, hey, we want to do it. And we sat down, we negotiated, and we were able to start building gardens in people's backyards. So as you see in the top, we take a flat piece of land and then we turn it into an urban farm or an urban garden. And it's more than that, because we don't do it during the day. We always do them on the weekends. So we'll have volunteers that come out, either from 5 to 50 people, to come out and build a garden in somebody's backyard. And when we're all said and done, we've got a beautiful garden and a happy resident. Then at the same time, my wife Judith, and we always joke about it, because when we first met at the same time that the farm started. So our relationship in the farm and its growth matches our relationship and matches our marriage. However, when we first got together, she grew up kind of just like I did, and probably like many of the people out there listening did. But you remember that Crisco can that you used to keep next to the stove with the grease in it that may have been used 3, 4, 5 times, and how you used to strain the grease and put that in there? Well, she came from that type of family, and so did I. So the idea of actually learning how to prepare or cook fresh produce was a total game changer. In fact, I think one of our first meals that was purely vegetarian was sauteed spinach, couscous, garlic, and a salad. And I think we ate that meal for probably about 4 or 5 months. However, being the enterprising woman that she is, she started to learn how to use those spices and how to cook those meals. And now she does cooking classes all over Sacramento. She's a sought after speaker to talk about how she went from Crisco can to raw food to, no meat and all those different things. And what you see in this picture here is an actual pop-up cooking class that we did in our backyard. All we have is a hot plate and a table. And various people from the community brought produce, and that's what we did. Now, this here is another thing that we did. This is an event that we did where we had a honey harvest. So we had bees in our backyard. And so what we did is we put out something, social media and the local community, walked around, gave out flyers, what have you. And we were able to get a bunch of people to come over to our house in the backyard as we were harvesting honey. So imagine young people being able to stick their fingers, and adults being able to stick their fingers into the honeycomb and pull their fingers out with fresh honey. And some people even got a bit of honey to take home with them. So this is just one of the ways that we're not just growing food, but we're also growing food, we're growing people, and we're growing community. And I can't tell you the amount of people that call or email and say, you know what, I saw you guys on the news, or I saw an article about you in the paper, and I'm now in the process of growing my own food. I may only have containers, but I'm going to do it anyways. Or somebody that's torn up their backyard and is putting beds in, and they're getting ready to start growing themselves their own destiny. We also can't forget about the young people. Cannot forget about the young people. So these young people here are part of our Project Good Youth Development, Youth Mentorship Program. GOOD is an acronym for growing our own destiny. And so we continue the idea of growing food, growing people, and growing community. And in doing so, what we do is we equip them with the skills to not only grow food, but to be able to cook food and at the same time uh, be able to understand themselves in relationship to agriculture. Why? Because everybody starts out as a seed. Every word that you speak is a seed. Every thought that you think is a seed. Every action you take is a seed. So we are creators, and that's what we teach them. And you can create a new life for yourself by what you eat, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And then recently, this is two of the county supervisors in our district when we put in our application to be approved for the first farm stand in Sacramento County. And this is on the heels of passing or helping to pass the Sacramento Urban Ag Ordinance, which makes it legal to grow food and sell food in your front yard. So that's when we were putting in the application. And since then, we've gotten approved and we've held our first farm stand. I just didn't get the opportunity to put the pictures in this presentation. These are some of the products that we would sell. That's homemade jam. You've got some cucumbers in the background, and you've also got some rosemary, all farm fresh. And what it really comes down to is to whom you give your money, that's who you give your power. And the more ways that we can start to pay ourselves, and when I say pay ourselves, I mean if I grow food and I'm in the community, then people should be coming to buy the food from me. Because in buying the food from me, then I can then turn around and employ our young people, employ the people walking around our neighborhoods that don't have anything to do. I regularly employ people in our neighborhood who, need a few dollars here and there to come and maybe cut some things or, provide them, food, that type of stuff. So we have to be very cognizant of who we're giving our money to. And because most people are eating at least once a day, and sometimes people don't, but for the most part, food is one of the most basic social and economical acts that everybody in a society takes place. Everybody's walking around doing something on a day-to-day basis to get that next dollar in order to get something to eat. Cheap workers need cheap care, that need cheap food, that need cheap fuel, that need cheap nature, that needs cheap lives. And this is the paradigm that we're in right now as it relates to urban agriculture. So we have to understand that when you go to other countries, I've learned this going to Italy. I learned this also as I spoke to farmers from all over the world, that most of the food that is consumed in the cities is grown by food that is very, very close to the city. And it's not called urban farming. It's just called survival. And it's always been like that. And I think one thing that really opened my eyes to that when I was in Italy is that one, food took so long to get to me. The first time I went to a restaurant, I was like, wait a minute, where's the food? Why is it taking so long? And so as I was talking to them, they're like, well, we're actually preparing your food. We're actually making certain things from scratch in the back here. It's not like the restaurants that you have in the United States where they're buying frozen this, frozen this, frozen this, and frozen that. We're actually preparing a meal. And so that's one thing that struck me. Another thing that struck me is that there were no fast food restaurants. Since then, I've been to Italy another time, and the last time I went, I spent 2 weeks there. There were no fast food restaurants. The only time I saw a fast food restaurant was in a train station. I saw a McDonald's. But 2 weeks, 3 fast food restaurants. So when you start to deal with food culture and understanding that not only is food like I said, a social thing, but it's also a cultural thing. There are certain ceremonies that are connected to certain types of foods, that are connected to harvests, that are connected to sowing, that are connected to different fruit trees maturing, and on and on and on. And all of that serves to give food a value, because we have all of these challenges in front of us. You've got, and I'm not even going to go through all this, but these are the things that we're dealing with when we are supporting the industrial and factory farming of our food. All of these things come from food. Food is a weapon. Food is also the most basic thing that we do on a day-to-day basis. And now they're talking about food and climate change, because food is now the source of 50% of the emissions that are going into the air, whether it's agricultural production itself, such as, you have animals that are being given these antibiotics. In fact, I think there was 5.6 million pounds of antibiotics purchased or given out to humans, while there was 11.5 million pounds of antibiotics and other medicines that were purchased to be given to animals. Also, chemical fertilizers, the production of chemical fertilizers and the use of chemical fertilizers has something to do with our ozone layer, deforestation, processing, transport, packing, and retail. The average plate of food takes 1,500 miles round trip to get to somebody's plate. And even here in Sacramento, and California in general, for those people that are not on this side of town, California feeds the world. But guess what? 99% of the food that is grown in California is exported. That means that while we feed the world in food, most of the food that we eat is coming from another country. So you can just imagine how much fossil fuel is being used to drive this food and fly this food all over the world. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start to sign off. But before I do that, I want to give you some tips that can help you to reduce not only your own carbon footprint, but to reduce the carbon footprint of your foods. And number one is to buy mostly locally grown food and locally grown and produced food. Like I said, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a climate change scientist. And when I speak at climate change events, I usually go on either before or after, scientists. And so they have all of these slides that science, and people are falling asleep through the presentation. But here's one thing that I know. The closer your food is to you and the less distance that you have to travel in order to get your food, it's got to be better for the planet. And there's people that would agree with me. Next, grow and compost your own garden. If you haven't learned how to compost, you should. If you have our email address, which will be on the last slide in this presentation, email us. I can send you or point you to some plans where you can make an easy, efficient, and inexpensive worm composting process out of 2 regular bins, plastic bins that you get from, Kmart or somewhere. So composting does 2 things. One, it allows you to recycle a lot of the kitchen scraps that you use or that you have left over from your food. In addition to that, when you saw that last slide, it was 2 to 4% of the food is wasted. Much of that food is wasted on farm, but many of that food is wasted for stuff that we buy, we don't eat it, and then we throw it away. So composting allows you to be able to save some of that food. And when you put compost back into your soil, it just completes the circle, and it completes the cycle of organic matter to grow food, harvest the food, grow food from seed, harvest it, eat it, and then take what's left over and put it back into the soil as compost, which then feeds the soil and then feeds you again. That's a perfect circle. Support farmers who sequester carbon in soil by making soil healthier with no-till, perennial emphasis, cover crops, compost and manure application, restoring land to ancient use, original grasslands to grasslands, and forests back to forests. So when you talk about no-till, you're talking about not disturbing the soil. Because when you rototill and all those other things, not only do you destroy the soil profile, but you also destroy the fungi, the bacteria, and the invertebrates, the FBI, that work in secret to keep the soil healthy. Compost crops, great for putting nitrogen back into the soil in the case of fava beans, and at the same time, things like wheat, vetch, cereal rye have very long root systems that are able to help break up soil and put air in between the soil. And when you cut it, you also get green material that you can use for your compost. Support farmers who use less energy with farming organically, using animals instead of machines for pruning, fertilizing, weeding, growing crops suitable to your locale, and therefore they require less water and less other inputs. You know, organic agriculture is starting to get watered down because while it is better and they're using organic materials, they're not producing any of those materials on farm. And so you really have an industrialized form of organic agriculture where, of course, like I said, you're doing organic methods, but you call up a company, oh yeah, I need you to drop me 55 yards of compost. And then you're pumping all of these things like fish emulsion and all those different types of things, which I'm not against fish emulsion, but I think you can make compost tea not using fish emulsion, and you can have the same type of return on investment for your crops if you use compost tea, especially if you buy an injector to be able to inject the compost tea into your watering system. But either way that it goes, you want to support the people that do those things, because when you support us and support farmers that do these things, then we're able to continue to do them and we're able to make a dent in the food system. Support farm worker unions. Much of the oppression that is still taking place in the United States as it relates to food has to do with farm workers, whether they're legal or illegal. In California, there's a place called Watsonville. There was a big deal because there was this company that made fruit, and they were spraying these toxic chemicals on the fruit. Sometimes they were spraying the chemicals on there while the farm workers were in the fields, and many of the farm workers, many of their children, all have breathing disorders. So they eventually were able to get them to outlaw a specific type of pesticide that they were using. Glean fruit, make food deserts in the gardens. So a gleaning program is very simple. You ever walk through your neighborhood and you see a bunch of trees and a bunch of fruit that's just falling on the ground and nobody's picking it up? Organize some people, organize your community, organize some friends. Go to the person that owns the house and say, hey, look, we'll harvest this fruit for you. We'll give you some. We'll take some to distribute to ourselves, and what we can't distribute to ourselves, then we'll give the rest to those less fortunate, homeless, take it to a food bank. And you can build a large movement behind that. Of course, you may have to get some tools, but when you first start out, you can just do it by just getting a ladder and being able to get into these trees to be able to get this fruit. Every year we take part in a harvest event through an organization in Sacramento where we have 12 teams of at least 10 people going out to maybe about 40 or 50 sites to harvest fruits from trees. And on that day, we harvest maybe about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of fruit in one day, in 8 hours. So you can think about how a program like that could grow to encompass really making a dent in some of the food that's already there. Many times we don't even have to focus on growing our own food. We can just look around and find that there's food already there that's going to waste. And turn food deserts into gardens. A food desert is nothing but a state of mind. That's what a food desert is. A food desert is a state of mind that doesn't know about what's going on. And so as you start to turn food deserts into gardens and you start to build gardens, especially what we've seen on our garden builds, you'll see that people come out of their house like, what are you guys doing? We're building a garden. Oh, are you? How do I get a garden? And then the next thing you know, you have 3 or 4 people on one block who all have gardens, and they're working together, they're trading produce with each other, and then you have a self-organizing, resilient food system that you can create. Lobby elected officials for sustainable local farming. I was always against politics until the last 2 years, and the reason why is because, of course, what has politics ever done for us? However, and what I've started to change into is understanding that local politics is much different than national politics. And there are local politicians, not a lot, that will help you. Most mayors, most county supervisors, or most, like for city council, for their districts, they have discretionary funds that if you can come to them with a good program or a product or a project or an event that's good for the community, that can bring people together and that can make some change, then they have the authority to give you money to do an event. So whether you like it or not, you may actually be able to get some, and it's not a grant, it's discretionary money that you can get. Of course, if you're going to get it for an event, at least do the event. But at the same time, they have the money. They're just waiting for somebody, in some cases, they're just waiting for somebody to come with a good idea. Eat mainly perennial plants. So a perennial plant is a plant that you only have to plant one time. And when you plant it one time, then you don't have to plant it again. And for every single annual plant, meaning that you plant it, it goes to seed, and then you have to replant it, there is a perennial alternative. So for lettuce, you have salad burnet, you have orach, you had good King Henry. That can be alternatives for lettuce. Of course, we know about mint and some of the herbs that perennials that you plant once and they come back. But think about asparagus. Asparagus is a perennial plant. That means that you plant asparagus one time, and if you take care of it right, you can eat asparagus every year for the next 10 to 15 years. And the reason why we don't know about perennials is because if we started replacing these annual plants that we have to get from these grocery stores with perennial plants, then that's bad for business. So seek out those things and find out about those perennial plants. Eat 100% pastured animals. If you're going to eat meat, find pastured animals, or they call it grass-fed beef. Why? Because if you saw the conditions of the meat that you get from your local burger place or In-N-Out, well, maybe not In-N-Out burgers, I'm not sure. I don't know about where they source their meat, so I'm not going to talk about In-N-Out. But McDonald's for sure, and most fast food restaurants for sure. I don't necessarily put In-N-Out in that same type of category because In-N-Out doesn't have a freezer. They don't have freezers in their restaurants. And when you order French fries, they take the potato right then and there, they crush it, and then they put it in the grease. So it's a little bit different. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a little bit different, so I don't know. But pastured animals are usually treated better. They have a better lifestyle. And when you think about eating the flesh of another animal, then whatever that animal's been through, or however that animal has been treated, it's going to go into its muscles. It's going to go into its system. So when you eat it, you're eating all that too. So you have to be very, very careful about what you eat when you eat meat. Eat mainly unprocessed food. It's easy to say, but the less processing on your food, the better it is for you. But the thing is the processing of the food also releases a bunch of chemicals into the air, and it's very, very bad, because then you have plastic to deal with. You have, plastic, paper, all these things that end up in landfills. So eating unprocessed food, you don't need all that. Prepare and store food with less energy. For example, the reason why we have winter squash and summer squash is because summer squash has a thin skin. You want to eat it right away. But the winter squash, the stuff with the thick skin, such as spaghetti squash, butternut squash, red curry squash, those keep. So back in the days, you'd grow your summer squash and your winter squash right alongside each other, and you'd eat the summer squash during the summertime, and then in the winter, you'd have what's called a root cellar, which is basically just a hole dug in the ground because it keeps the temperature better. And you throw all your root crops, such as your carrots, your beets, turnips, as well as your winter squash in your root cellar, and it would keep all throughout the winter, and you wouldn't have to worry about a refrigerator. This is what people used to do. So think about preparing your food and storing your food with less energy. You can go online and you can get plans to make a solar oven that can heat up water or boil water. At the same time, you can if you want to spend a little money, you can buy an oven that it can get so hot it can roast meat. So think about those types of things that you can do. They even have something called a biogas digester, where you put in your kitchen scraps, and you can even put in meat and cheese and all the things that you don't put in a regular compost process, and it turns that into gas that you can then hook a stove or one of those portable stoves to, and it gives you a liquid fertilizer that you can use in your plants. So there's alternatives out there. You just have to look. And last but not least, teach others about sustainable just eating. Teach people about this. And another thing that we have to really do is we have to really talk about the legacy of white supremacy and racism as it relates to our food system. This is one of the reasons why when you go to ag school anywhere in the United States, they do not tell you about the ancient methods of how the Chinampus is the forerunner to the raised bed system. They don't tell you about the Ebers papyrus and how they found 700 different types of herbs and prescriptions of how to heal people, as well as that horticultural prowess of ancient Kemet, and even going back all the way to Ethiopia with pearl millet and sorghum and some of those basic grains that they found to be at the beginning of agriculture. So as you start to teach about sustainable just eating, you have to remove the myths of who actually started to grow food and restore the idea of what a farmer truly is. Most people think a farmer is somebody that grows food to sell it. And while that may be one function, if a farmer is growing food, is growing herbs, then that also makes the farmer the medicine person. It also makes the farmer or the farm itself or the place where the food is grown as the center of the community. Because once you grow food, you have to eat it. And in every culture that I know of, that I've studied, eating food is a ceremonial occasion where we got the big mama, which I used to do with my grandmother, where you get up at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and if you're not growing it in your backyard, you go to the farmer's market or you go to the store and you buy your beans and you're shucking peas. And while you're shucking peas, somebody else is making another part of the meal. And while that part of the meal is being made, another part of the meal is being made. And you've got the whole family together. And the wisdom that the women and the men in the family have is being passed on to the younger generation as they take part in making the meal. So we have to restore not just the fact of growing food and being able to sell the food, but we have to restore the culture of the field, which is what agriculture is. And with that, I want to thank you for listening, and please follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, catch us on Instagram, and you can call us or go to our website and you can get in contact with us to find out more about our programs. And even if you're in a different city than we are, we're willing to share information with you on how you can do similar things in your own city. So once again, I'd like to thank you for being a part and listening and sharing and receiving for the 2017 Black Sustainability Summit. My name is Chanowk Yirsael, and I'm signing off. Shalom.